I'll just wait for this to load. There it goes. Thank you very much for having me here today. The title of my presentation is The Missing Link, the perspective of the Gasfield from the kitchen table, which is basically where I've spent the last 6 years talking to impacted landholders. My name's Shay, I'm a mother, I'm a health and safety professional, I'm a Gasfield resident, I'm a landholder advocate, and I'm currently completing my Masters in OHS&E, which is Occupational Health, Safety and Environment. In my landholder advocacy role, I've worked with approximately 30 families who have been personally dealing with the impacts of unconventional gas industry in the Western Downs in Queensland. 12 of those families are no longer living in those original circumstances, and this is the circumstances that they are living in. So what you can see here is this circle here is the exclusion zone erected by the Department of Environment over the Link energy contamination. You can see up here, this pin is where they're planning to dump the salt from the brine from the process. That's priority agricultural land and 50 metres from the creek into the Murray-Darling Basin. This is a frac sand quarry that they're working on extracting fracking sand from a really important ecological area that we also have to try and fight. These things come about because of the government's exceptionally great method of risk assessment. All of these yellow dots you'll see here are gas wells. So each of those gas wells is one of those triangles, but what isn't counted in those triangles is all of the other infrastructure that goes with each of those triangles. The purple lines, which you can almost see, are all of the pipelines, the major pipelines crisscrossing the community. I wouldn't have an excavator ticket if you paid me these days. Also, what you can see here is the red shading. You can just see, can you see that red shading? That is all of the land that the CSG companies have purchased from the community. So that's all of the land that is no longer populated by community members. Those people are no longer buying their feed in Chinchilla. Those people are no longer volunteering at the Meals on Wheels. Those kids are no longer in school. So that's a pretty significant impact just in itself, and that isn't addressed in any research at all. It's not picked up on, and it's certainly not advertised. And those red X's are the locations of the National Pollutant Inventory emission locations. So yes, that's Chinchilla, that's where I live. What you are also seeing there, those black circles, is the stock and domestic water bores that the farmers have that are no longer going to be available to them, that will be removed from access either immediately, in the very near future, or in the longer term. And you can see these white circles here where, when I was living in Hopeland, the start of the wells, the stock and domestic water bores of the farmers blowing gas instead of water that were getting made good on just in the 12 months prior to me leaving Hopeland. And that's without any actual drilling happening. So the impacts are far and in front of the leading line of where the actual work is. What is also missing there are all of the what isn't on that picture is all of the stock and domestic water bores that have already been made good. They disappear off Google Earth, which is one of the reasons why I was trying to plot them as they were going. So that's what we're talking about. That's what you're looking at having here. Why not? As a landholder advocate and as a person who's actually been through the process as well, I've witnessed the impacts that this industry has on the community. I've witnessed their business impacts, the impacts on the family, people's health, their safety, and certainly the impacts on our very fundamental human rights. That experience is what prompted me to become the convener of the evidence that we supplied to the International Permanent People's Tribunal that was held this year on the issue. The session was called Human Rights, Fracking and Climate Change. Well, I don't like the term fracking. They were using that term colloquially to represent the entire unconventional gas process, not simply the process of fracking. So that session was held in May 14th, the week of May 14th, and there were 10 judges, international judges, who attended that session of the Permanent People's Tribunal, and they heard evidence from the USA, Australia, Canada, UK and Latin America. Interestingly, and it will be interesting to you, the specific evidence from Latin America came from the group of people who are currently enjoying the work from David Casey, who left Australia after he'd finished Eastern Star work here in Narrabri. So he's actually, at the time of that, was responding to, strangely, not reporting a spill in his workplace over there in Latin America. So not only are we exporting gas, we're exporting the problems from Australia as well. That information at the Permanent People's Tribunal, if you haven't heard about what the Permanent People's Tribunal is it's headquartered in Rome. It's an internationally recognised civil society tribunal that functions independently of the states and governments and other authorities, and it applies internationally recognised human rights law and policy to the issues that are brought to it. The really important part of the PPT is the mission that they have to give those people, in their quest for respect, self-determination and dignity of life, a chance to speak out, to fight and gain visibility, which is precisely what the problem was that we're facing with this industry. Our contribution to the tribunal, you can go to this web address, www.peoplestribunalongas.org, and that's where you can see the evidence that we provided is actually hosted there, and also you can just Google Spring Creek Project Permanent People's Tribunal and you will see all of the evidence that was provided in the actual session, so you can go and see what was delivered internationally. What we requested of the tribunal was that they consider not just what we're facing right now. Because the industry is expanding at such a huge rate, we asked them to consider also the potential for future harm, not just the harm that's been committed to date. And what we asked the tribunal to do is help us make our government start listening to us as stakeholders and not so much to the shareholders. And what was also very interesting, incredibly validating for us, was that the very same evidence that the government has heard from us already and the multiple submissions that we've all written has fallen on the government's deaf ears. But once that evidence was heard by the Permanent People's Tribunal, they've issued this preliminary statement prior to their judgment, which will be coming out in September. This is what the PPT said once they heard our evidence. That the evidence we provided clearly demonstrates that the industry has failed to fulfil its legal and moral obligations, and that the government has failed in their responsibility to regulate the industry in order to protect people and communities. So it's been validated. There is a very serious problem here. This is a really important work that's been done that you guys in New South Wales can grab a hold of and use to your advantage in trying to stop this industry from coming to you. And we haven't even received the judgment yet, but they also went on to say that the unconventional gas industry is definitely affecting the human rights of individuals and communities, with specific and dramatic consequences to the Indigenous population. This is also very important. They say in their preliminary statement that the practice that the government and the industry have of devaluating our human rights in the process of undertaking their work is most of the time planned, and it's implemented intentionally. And when it's found out, they deny or hide that activity. And further, the existence of the absence of clear legislation to manage this issue is not recognised by the government as a vacuum that they have to jump on and really fill really quickly, but it's used as an excuse to go on with impunity. So basically the PPT has described in their preliminary statement that this industry is a sort of systematic crime architecture. What we provided evidence was in the categories of health, environment and climate change, infrastructure and social and cultural impacts. But I thought instead of furthering and sharing all of what I know, I thought a more appropriate approach today might be to ask you to look at a really specific real-life example and see what it is how that affects you. Do you have enough information? What do you need to be able to deal with this very specific real-life example? But before that, I just wanted to give you a little bit more work to understand the realities of living in that gas field that Geraldine and the previous speakers have already given you some ideas of. And basically, it starts at the beginning. To not already assume that there is an impact by this industry is absurd, when all you need to do is look at the before and after pictures. Before gas wells, except all of that red is the land that the CSG companies now own. Before gas wells, after gas wells. Before, after. How can there not be an impact? But what that means from a street level for host farmers that are impacted, this averages out to a well density of 1 to 2 wells per square kilometre. And that's not counting all of the rest of the infrastructure that goes with each of those wells and the attended operation and maintenance activities. In fact, it's been researched and quantified in purely economic terms that a host farmer risks losing an average of $2.7 million over the 20 years of impacts. So if there's a financial impact that can be measured, there must be another impact that can be measured. And this is just a starter list of the infrastructure that's associated with each of those yellow dots. And it's just a list, it's just words, which is much better and told in pictures. This is a farmer's pasture for grazing sheep. Clearly, I mean, that's what it looks like, isn't it? That's prefabricated cement going across an existing pipeline, and those bollards are what you see on the main road going, you know, when you're travelling. It's not what you expect to see in a pasture for a farmer for his sheep. This is how the industry also sees that exact property. So they're looking at that property as just a means, jigsaw, part of a jigsaw puzzle. What's missing from that picture is, where is the homestead for that farmer? Where is his water tanks? Where is the stuff that's important to him? It's not considered at all. And this is the real life. This is someone's paddock. This is the installation of the gas field. It's just one example of just the level of dust that is incomprehensible by anyone who hasn't lived through it. This is a famous picture, but I helped the person who took this photo make a complaint to the EHP about this truck, which is spilling water from the gas field, probably from a well, from a drilling rig, onto the ground, right in the middle of a flood. You can see there's a floodway right there. So, I mean, you can draw those conclusions yourself, can't you? So we did complain to the government about that, and they came back and said, yeah, I don't think you can assume that that's coal seam gas. So yeah, no problem. This is my kid's bus stop. So clearly that looks like a bus stop for school, doesn't it? This is the industry taking over your community. Nothing is sacred. This is a multi-well pad that is the new and interesting way in which they can access land that they're not allowed to put wells on. So they just put a bunch of wells in one location and directionally, horizontally drill to access the area that they need to. And this is another incident that I helped a farmer investigate. There's a high point vent that's designed to just let gas out of the water line from the gas well. So it's releasing gas unmitigated and unmonitored. But what it's also doing here is having a failure and is leaking coal seam gas produced water directly onto the farmer's property. So you can see that the fence around that the industry installs is very effective in preventing that impacting the outside of their fence line, which is the farmer's property. So with this farmer, we had to agitate quite a lot to get this incident investigated. First of all, the industry hadn't recognised it was happening, so the farmer had to bring it to their attention. When he did bring it to their attention, and we made several complaints about it because it started happening to several high point vents on his property, and interestingly also along that whole pipeline, there was a failure in the mechanics within inside that high point vent that they then went and swapped out, which is good. But in the process, in the complaint, we said, well, look at that piece of tubing, it's designed into that high point vent. And they said, yes, it is, and it's doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is to allow a certain amount of millilitres per year, no, a certain amount of millilitres per day out of that high point vent, just as a method of it working. But when you calculated that out, it was something like 262,000 litres of CSG produced water per high point vent per year onto the property. So, and this is an example of how inadequately the engineering methods are put in place on this particular industry. Also, when we complained, we wanted to get the soil tested right there then to see if there was any impact on the sodium absorption ratio of the soil. And it took the industry 4 weeks and 4 inches of rain to undertake any testing of that soil. But interestingly, even after the 4 inches of rain, there was still a detectable change in the sodium absorption ratio of that particular piece of soil. So, yeah, it was inconclusive. And the EHP turned up to the property with the industry and in the same car and stood with the industry explaining to the farmer and myself about how it's not a problem unless there's a contaminant in there. It's far too late and, well, you can work that out. This is a low point drain that I'm not sure if you can see there, but a low point drain is designed to capture the water falling out of the gas pipeline, and that has been experiencing some leak over a long period of time. So that's, again, well encapsulated by the safety fence there of the industry. Seen the impact of flares in the night sky. It's very disconcerting, to say the least. And the power transmission lines. So these high tensile power lines are installed specifically for the use of the industry. They're inappropriately classified under the planning system as community infrastructure, and they fall out of otherwise industry impact assessments. So it's another example of an impact of the industry that's not assessed. So the implementation of all of that industry infrastructure ultimately results in the death of the farmer's infrastructure. So this is an example of a Kickin water bore. So this is a stock and domestic water bore that is blowing gas instead of water. So there is more water, there's more gas coming out of that stock and domestic water bore due to the dewatering of that aquifer, and the gas is, like Tim Forsey just said in that report, finding another way out that isn't conveniently up the gas well. This is a picture of water taken directly from a farmer's water bore, and it's bubbling like it's boiling on the stove, but it's bubbling methane. So there are hundreds of thousands of dollars currently being spent, as Geraldine just indicated, by CSIRO and Jazeera. There's a methane flux study currently happening. There's an ambient air monitoring study happening. And as Geraldine said, there's an intention to undertake a type of health study. But my comments on this is that Jazeera and the CSIRO are standing outside of the industry's fences and outside of the farmers' fences, undertaking this generic testing that, once you cut through all of the salami slicing in their reports, says, yes, there is methane in the gas field that is attributable to the industry. And it says, yes, there is particulate pollution and there are BTNXs in the gas field that is attributable to the industry. And what they've managed is to establish some methodology of undertaking a health impact study. So 3 years of that, hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent to address what we already know. In fact, that quote there is directly from the industry. They are quoting them saying that the project emissions adversely impact air quality, leading to exposure of community to contaminants. We already know this, and the industry even acknowledges that. And the industry already has its own established health impact assessment methodology, which has never been implemented in Australia. And with regard, and very respectively, to Jazeera CSIRO, there are, I believe, really serious ontological, which is their version of reality, and axiological, which is their philosophical position, real problems with those assumptions that are made. And it impacts their methodology they use in their research, and it affects their interpretation of the results. Generally speaking, those studies sanitise the situation, and they implicitly assume that there's no problem. They fail to take any operational load and spatial realities into detailed consideration, so there's no discussion in the reports of what load the compressor stations are running at, where the compressor stations are in relation to the testing, any actual operational data, which is a really important variable in a study, you would think. And they fail to give serious considerations to the residents' feedbacks. And they failed to take the opportunity consistently to gather baseline data at newly established work fronts, which there are all the time. There's a multitude of opportunities for them. Every time a CCA is sought, it's a great opportunity for the Jazeera to pop out and do some baseline studies, but it's not undertaken. And they failed to take into consideration the impacts on the host family or the host farmer expected to have this industry on their doorstep, in their business, in their home. So even with hundreds of papers available to you guys that identifies the land, and Melissa mentioned them earlier, identifying the land, air and water impacts, again, the perspective of the host family is not considered. And it's easy to get caught up in that global approach, but it's really important to understand what's missing. And that leads me to what I've chosen to undertake as my research study for my master's, and that is the workplace health and safety implications for farmers hosting unconventional gas. I think it's really important to identify, is the workplace health and safety relationship between the unconventional gas industry and the landholder captured by the legislation? I believe it is. Is the workplace health and safety legislative relationship between those two parties enforced? I believe it isn't. And is the workplace health and safety relationship captured by the unconventional gas companies' corporate governance themselves? And can the workplace health and safety impact on the host farmer be qualified via the presence of new hazards for that farmer to have to deal with? And I think this is also really important because it has implications for the obligations of the state and the federal government, because they, after all, are the owners of the resource that's being accessed, and they are also the issuers of the titles that give these companies access to these properties. So what I think needs to happen, which isn't happening, and this is a magnificent model that is actually from the industry's paradigm themselves, I believe we need to do basic hazard identification. There needs to be a dose response assessment. There needs to be exposure assessment. None of that's happening. And unless any of that's happening, how can you possibly believe there is any risk management happening? So let's take an example of a farmer. This beautiful property is owned by a particular family out my way. And look, it's beautiful. It's got a creek running through it, two little creeks running through it. It's gorgeous. And they are actually organic farmers. they've got certification and they're working really hard to maintain that. They run sheep and cattle. That's where they live in relation to the rest of that particular area. So you can see the impact the industry has encroaching around them. So that particular family don't have any infrastructure on their place, but that's their boundary fence, and that's what's happening next to them. You can see their fence in that picture as well. And this is an exact photo that was taken of the dust over their pasture just 2 weeks ago. That dust is on their roof, in their tanks, in their house and on the surfaces. They know that that's happening all around them. They also know that there's a lot of these all around them. Yeah, the sound was working when I tried this earlier. Anyway, you're going to miss it now. Oh.
Leaking out of there. Argyle 22. Now is this for uncontrolled gas leak? Argyle 19, leaking out of there.
So the family knows that they're surrounded by all of those unmitigated, uncontrolled leaks of emissions. And the family also knows, because we've done this sampling, we've done this testing, us mums and dads out there in Chinchilla have taken samples and found out that this is a list of what else comes out of the gas with the methane. So it's not just methane, like Geraldine was saying earlier, that the Jazeera say that methane isn't a health risk, it's just a problem because it's asphyxiant, so it's not toxic, we're not going to measure that. But methane isn't by itself, it's accompanied by a whole bunch of other compounds. And these measurements we've taken from high point vents, from hydraulic power units, from Kickin water bores. And this family also knows that they're surrounded by the National Pollutant Inventory emissions from the industry. And as Geraldine indicated before, this is just from QGC's Kenya Central Processing Plant. And you can see there they've reported in just 2015-2016 just 80,000 tonnes of formaldehyde for one central processing plant. And this family know that they're surrounded by those emissions. So they go out of their way to very formally, very carefully request information from the government and the industry because they are very concerned, given their business is organic, they want to maintain their certification, they really need to understand the impacts that this is having on their business and on their family. They're suffering noise, dust, light, atmospheric contaminants. They're really worried about trespassing contaminants onto their property, and including simple things like weeds, because I'm sure weeds don't obey boundary lines either. And they also requested detailed information about the location of infrastructure all around them so they can proactively identify some of these potential contaminants and impacts. They also requested baseline testing, so they wanted to have the industry and the government undertake baseline testing on their property to see what levels of methane are escaping from the ground now, what levels of dust they're putting up with, what levels of contaminants are in their water tanks now, before it gets any further encroaching on them. They've also asked for detailed information on how the company is complying with the Environmental Authority. All very reasonable requests for information and data, don't you think? Wouldn't you want to know that information if you were living in that circumstance? So the response that was received by the family from the industry was, with respect to your questions, we can assure you that we operate in an environmentally responsible manner. The response we got from the government was, from Toowoomba, we can't see that there's any problem at all with compliance. But if you do have any complaints, be sure to contact the pollution hotline. So we did, and they responded saying, yeah, that dust complaint you have isn't our problem, you'll have to talk to the local council. To which we replied to them saying, well, yes, it is your problem. And they said, oh, yeah, yes, it is our problem, but you haven't filled the form in properly. So that's the real life problems at the kitchen table for this family, and they have no infrastructure on their place. So what do you need to know? What if this family came to you as their GP and said that they were concerned about their state of health, concerned about the levels of stress in the family, concerned about any number of issues that Geraldine and Melissa just raised earlier, and Helen. So what do you need to know? Do you feel as though the government's given you enough information? Do you feel as though environmental impact statements addressing all of those questions when it comes to you and your family and what you'll need to deal with? So basically, what we've just looked at there is that our fundamental human rights, the right to the highest attainable health and access to information and informed consent, are really good examples of the government failing and violating those rights. So thank you very much for your time.